Hi everyone, this is Matt here, and today I will be bringing you a Draw My History video on World Wars I and II. Considered to be two of the worst events in human history, the impact of the wars were and can still be felt by many around the world today. War and its consumption of human life would lead to 8.5 million dead by the end of World War I, and a staggering 60 million deaths in World War II. 11 million of those 60 million that died would consist of 6 million Jews and 5 million others, including gypsies, homosexuals, Christian minorities, and other races. Never have wars been so violently fought since, and never has a generation been so heavily affected by battle. Unlike other wars, the so-called Great War would be fought using guns, vehicles, chemicals, and many other modern weapons. No war had been fought in this way before, so old war tactics would prove ineffective for soldiers. Despite the violence surrounding the Great War, many would still volunteer to join, giving each military power millions of soldiers at their disposal. Soon after the war began, Germany would try to invade France, but would be halted, forcing each side to dig protective trenches on the Western Front. At this point, Russia had been halted by Prussia's forces on the Eastern Front, and the Ottomans had joined in, opening up the war to many other countries. Practically all major nations were fighting in the war. Despite this, America would try to remain neutral throughout the course of the Great War. At the war's conception, President Wilson called for neutrality, believing he could influence the post-war settlement. Additionally, the country faced its own issues, such as race division and religious conflicts. Even giants of industry, such as Henry Ford and Andrew Carnegie, opposed the war, to a point of sending a peace ship to Europe in hopes of helping end the war. Neutrality would prove a challenge in the long run, however. The U.S., wishing to trade with all warring nations, would eventually be influenced by Britain to go to war. In September of 1914, British ships blocked off the Central Powers' food and military supply. Despite Wilson's sentiments on how the blockade was a violation of neutral carriers, Allied traders more than made up for economic losses. Over the next 2 years, trade with Britain and France would grow fourfold, amounting to $3.2 billion in 1916. By the next year, the Allies had borrowed $2.5 billion in funds from the States. The Central Powers had only attained $56 million in loans and trade profits, easily showing the neutral America's hypocrisy. In response to British control of the oceans, Germans would create the U-boats. U-boats, more commonly known as submarines, traveled underwater and could attack most ships at the time undetected. With this new weapon, Germany would access Britain in April of 1915, warning all ships that flew the British flag or allied themselves with Britain that they were liable to destruction. Just a few short weeks later, the Lusitania would be torpedoed by a U-boat, killing 128 Americans and 1,198 others. The attack infuriated America. Wilson would begin to reconsider his opinions and tried to mediate in Europe. Realizing neither side wanted peace, Wilson would begin to build up U.S. military strength in preparation of war. In the wake of these events, Germany would have to sign a treaty declaring it must warn enemies of U-boat attacks. However, this treaty was violated within a few weeks, and Germany continued its unrestricted submarine warfare. This effectively broke off communication with Germany and the States. Things finally blew up when Britain intercepted the Zimmermann telegram, which urged Mexico to declare war on the U.S. and join the Central Powers. In the meantime, German U-boats began to attack U.S. ships with no warning. On April 6, 1917, Wilson declared war on Germany. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Russia experienced a series of revolutions. The February Revolution effectively destroyed their leadership, but the country still remained in the war. Then, in the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks, after being fought by sent-in U.S. troops, would take control of Russia and sign a peace treaty with Germany, leaving the Central Powers able to stage an offensive on the Western Front. By May 1918, Germany had advanced 50 miles into Paris. In this crucial moment, 60,000 U.S. soldiers would be sent in to support French defense, pushing Germany to a halt in July. By September, Germany would be forced to retreat. By November, German forces would be overwhelmed and broken by the U.S. On November 11, 1918, Germany signed an armistice, ending the war and giving victory to the Allies. In the aftermath of the war, America would be left with almost 4 million U.S. soldiers at its disposal. Most Americans were able to avoid the challenges of long-term trench warfare, but the human cost would still be high. Over 50,000 servicemen died in combat, and another 63,000 died from disease. In the next 6 months, a peace conference in Versailles would be held to determine the terms and conditions for the end of the war. The conference itself was based on Wilson's 14 points, which would lead to the formation of a League of Nations, an organization guaranteeing all countries had independence and territorial integrity. The League would deal with all international disputes. In the end, the League was dysfunctional and acted more as an exclusion of other countries that the States, France, and Great Britain took charge of. Germany would be held responsible for the entirety of the war and would end up paying over $33 billion in reparations to other countries, a debt only just paid off in 2010. Now that World War I has come to a close, we can focus on how World War II is directly linked to decisions surrounding the unsettlement of the Great War. Because of the massive debt Germany owed, it would fall into a Great Depression shortly after World War I. This depression would give rise to a movement known as fascism, spearheaded by Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, Tojo in Japan, and Francisco Franco in Spain. World War II was a direct result of tensions building since World War I. Germany suffered under the blame put on it by World War I, and Japan and Italy were anxious to expand their empires in the wake of the war. German fascism centered around Aryan superiority. The first international challenges would not come from Germany, but from Japan and Italy. Japan sought to expand its empires, and in doing so inspired Mussolini to invade Ethiopia, one of the few remaining independent countries of Africa. At the same time, Germany began to present a major threat to existing world order. World War I reparation payments, a massive depression, fear of Russian communism, labor unrest, and unemployment would lead to the rise of Hitler and his Nazi Party. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany and was given dictatorial powers to deal with the economic crisis. Hitler outlawed other political parties, arrested many of his political rivals, and proclaimed himself Führer, or leader, of Germany. His goals would be total world domination and to create a superior Aryan race. Hitler blamed the Jews for most of Germany's problems and would begin to exterminate them by the 1940s in his concentration camps. In violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler would begin to rearm the Rhine lands in Germany, and then he would form the Rome-Berlin Axis with Mussolini, combining their countries' military strengths. In 1936, Germany made a military alliance with Japan against the Soviet Union. Germany had begun to spread across Europe at this point, conquering many countries and expanding its empire, thus forming the Axis powers. Despite these developments, the U.S. was still reluctant to enter the war. Acting President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was distracted by economic struggle and New Deal programs, but still could see the amassing threat in Europe. By 1941, Nazi U-boats and American ships began fighting in the Atlantic. Roosevelt knew war would come, but tried to stave it off for as long as possible. Franklin Delano Roosevelt began to prioritize events in Europe, and with no distraction, Japan's military began to grow. In 1940, Hideki Tojo became the War Minister of Japan, and as his first goal, occupied Indochina, which would cause the States to cut off oil trade with Japan in retaliation. Roosevelt hoped this would deter Japan from any further action, but when Indochina was invaded in July 1941, all trade was halted with Japan as a response, including vital oil shipments that accounted for almost 80% of Japanese fuel consumption. In October of 1941, Tojo became the Prime Minister of Japan and would prepare for war against the States. America knew Japan was planning an attack, but did not know where. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese would bomb Pearl Harbor, killing 2,400 Americans. America would declare war on Japan shortly after, prompting Germany to declare war on the States. The U.S. during this time interned all Japanese citizens within the country. The U.S., Soviet Union, and Britain prioritized war in Europe over Japan, making the surrender of Germany their first goal. Throughout 1942, Allies suffered at the hand of Germany. While Nazi ground forces pushed into Soviet-occupied territory, U-boats were sent out to intercept American convoys carrying vital oil and supplies to Britain and the Soviets. During the winter of 1942 to 1943, the tide began to churn, and the Allies began to push Germany back. But it wasn't until D-Day, a planned sea-to-ground invasion of Normandy, that Germany would be conquered. On June 6, 1944, soldiers would invade Normandy and liberate France. The sheer amount of overwhelming power would end Germany's campaign. In December 1944, German troops would lose their final offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler would commit suicide. Germany had lost the war. Americans would find a terrible secret buried within the Axis. When Allied troops advanced into Germany and Poland, they would find out just what the final solution really was. The so-called final solution was a series of death camps that had killed 6 million Jews and 5 million others. It was not news to the states that Jews had been persecuted in Germany, as the U.S. had barred entry into them when they were trying to flee the country. However, no one had known that Hitler would go so far in his attempt to rid himself of the Jewish race. With the defeat of Germany, the U.S. could focus full attention on Japan. After crippling the American battle fleet in Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invaded Guam, Hong Kong, and Wake Island. They then proceeded to conquer the Solomon Islands, Burma, and Malaya. In May of 1942, U.S. forces in the Philippines were defeated, and 10,000 American POWs would be viciously murdered. The war was looking bad. Just at that same moment, America would score two major victories. The very same month, America would halt the Japanese offensive against Australia in the Battle of the Coral Sea, off southern New Guinea. Soon after, in June, America would win the Battle of Midway, where the Japanese fleet was defeated by American aircraft. In October of 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf would win back the Philippines and destroy most of the Japanese fleet. By 1945, the defeat of Japan seemed likely. Just as Roosevelt was planning a full invasion of Japan, he suffered from a brain hemorrhage and died April 2, 1945. Taking over for FDR would be Harry Truman. In an angry rage, Truman would drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war with Japan. The tolls of both World War I and II were immense, amounting to over 68.5 million deaths. At home, war pushed racial tensions to an all-time high, with Japanese internment, and abroad, an entire generation would be lost to the world, forever changed by battle. The atrocities of battle can be felt on all sides. There are still survivors of the war, of the Holocaust, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Civilian casualties were the worst of all. We can never truly forget something as horrific as these wars, or we may face one ourselves in the near future.